Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. My name is Dr. Benjamin Porter. I am an assistant professor of Near Eastern Archaeology in the Department of Near Eastern Studies here at Berkeley. I'm also the acting director of the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology, which is a 114-year-old museum here on campus that has materials from the Middle East, but also from around the world. I'm charged with summing things up. So this want to thank, but let's do some thank yous real quick. So thanks to the Center for Middle East Studies, to Dr. Emily Gottschrick and her hardy crew for putting together this wonderful day of talks. I realize that my comments today are the only thing standing between today and whatever you're doing this evening. So I'm going to try to keep things brief. I realize I have about a half hour. But let me give you my perspective so you know where I'm coming from. I've been an archaeologist who's worked in the Middle East for the last 20 years, and most of my work has been focused in the country, in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And I've been working in the Middle East since I was very young, since I was an undergraduate. And my experiences there, I started working around the Oslo Accords in 1994. So I believe the Oslo moment between Israel and Palestine have really informed how I think about the Middle East. Here comes my glass of water, thank goodness. Yeah. And so I've been working, and I've certainly done nothing else but work in the Middle East. So I have a large index, if you will, of experiences with which I can reflect on the history of the discipline in my 20 years in what's largely a 130-year-old discipline. And so I've been thinking in this new project of mine, not just about the sort of modern history of the discipline of what I call Near Eastern archaeology, that is the archaeologists who work in the Middle East, whether or not they're Europeans or North Americans or Middle Easterners themselves. I'm really interested in that relatively recent history, say from 1960 to today, but I've also been thinking a lot about the future, thinking about what do archaeologists in the next 20 or 30 years who will be working in the region, what do they need to know? What do they need to be trained in? And how is the field changing and responding to new technologies as well as historical events on the ground? And so I feel very obligated to ask this question because I also train archaeologists here at Berkeley. And as you'll hear in my comments, toward the end of my comments, I'm very much concerned that we're really not training them to work in the Middle East in which we're working. So that's my perspective. I'll be speaking today from the perspective of a Near Eastern archaeologist and not an artist, which I wish I could, but that's not me. So I'm also going to structure, I'm going to begin my comments today from a rather cynical position, but I'm gradually going to take us to a more hopeful position, and then I'll certainly comment on some questions that I have for our panelists that I would love to have answered either today or in the future. I want to point out that this symposium joins many others that are taking place across Europe and North America. I see them coming across on the listservs. And they're concerned with the destruction of archaeological resources in current Middle East conflicts. I believe this attention is warranted, as many of today's commentators have pointed out. However, I do want to ask the question for us here today. I want to ask the question why and why now? Now, a colleague of mine once half-joked that if all Middle Eastern political and ethnic conflicts were solved, an entire industry of scholars, activists, and journalists that subsist on reporting, analyzing, and advocating would be quickly out of a job. For those actors, the Middle East is a career, to paraphrase Disraeli, and so it's with many of our speakers, including me, for better or for worse. So I want to raise the cynical question: are we meeting today because of the academic and monetary currencies that are currently available to us to discuss it? Journalists and TV talk show hosts are suddenly interested in interviewing us. Postdoctoral fellowships are suddenly available for our freshly minted PhDs to study the situation. TED, the organization TED, is handing out cash awards to some of our colleagues, and so on. So there are a number of benefits. So I'd like all of us to reflect on the ways that the archaeology industry profits from regional conflicts, whether it is in the Middle East or elsewhere. So I told you I'd begin from a very cynical position, so I'm not disappointing you. Yeah. So let's spend some time exploring how archaeologists can mitigate this bind in which they find themselves as practitioners of a discipline charged with investigating the global past through its material remains. Let's begin by stating that archaeologists have been, they currently are, and will always be entangled in the contemporary politics and economies in which they conduct their work. Now, this is an obvious point to everyone today, I think. And if it's something that's new to you today, then I think this panel, if it's done anything, it's got that point across to you. But I need to point out that this now accepted principle was heretical throughout most of the 20th century, and I'd maybe put a date about 2005 when we finally started to break through and convince our colleagues in the ivory tower that that's in fact a true statement. I recall several exchanges in which faculty members and professional associations that ignored or argued that they ignored this fact, or they argued that archaeologists have intellectual immunity and should not be held responsible for contributing to narratives of ethnic identity or conflict. Quote, that we study the past and cannot control how our discoveries are interpreted, they would contend. And I remember many of my mentors at the University of Pennsylvania, archaeologists that I worked with in the Middle East, would always make this contention as an excuse for why we don't need to invest our time and energies into understanding the local scene, if you want to call it. I remember many impassioned arguments, in fact, with Penn faculty members who I love dearly and have passed on in life, but nevertheless were quite resistant to the idea that archaeology had a political, was politically embedded in some way. So I'm happy to see that this 20th century sentiment is falling away. Now let's also recognize the, I think this really needs to be said in this group today because I haven't heard it come up, and that's really questioning this idea of value and its connection to heritage. Let's recognize the arbitrary value that people place on objects and monuments that have been destroyed or under threat. How things come to be classified as heritage is a process through which objects and things are revalued by different groups based on their own subjective definitions of self and other. I've argued elsewhere that heritage is a sense of the self that's projected into and onto the past, whether that is a sense of self of the personal self or the collective self. That is to say that heritage is in no way naturally constituted. It's subject to revision based on the cultural and historical contingencies and forces that create the context for interpretation and definition. So I contend that before ISIS could destroy could destroy anything, but let's just say the winged Lamassu at Nineveh, somebody had to isolate and define the Lamassu as an object of historical and cultural value. That somebody, of course, is the archaeologist who excavates the objects. I'm thinking here of Layard, Austin Henry Layard. The museum curator who displays it in a gallery in Paris or in Chicago or Mosul. The instructor who teaches it to students, instructor like me, who teaches it to students in their university classes. The government official who places the Lamassu's image on state symbols of money or on billboards or in tourism brochures. As professionals, therefore, we need to recognize the role that we play in creating an assemblage of things that others can respond to. We must acknowledge that it is Near Eastern archaeology that has taught ISIS the cultural and historical value of the Lamassu. We can then ask the opposite question. Why are we suddenly concerned about ISIS's destruction of a stone Lamassu, and yet rarely show concern for the natural and cultural forces that destroy archaeological materials in more subtle ways? We do not hear concerns for the erosion of soil deposits that destroy the organic and inorganic evidence with which we can reconstruct ancient diets. Nor is there much discussion of the positive and negative impacts of animal grazing on archaeological sites in the region. Indeed, we seem to be drawn to those instances of destruction that impact a narrow class of objects, usually those things that constitute the canon of ancient Near Eastern art from groups who are classified as civilizations, from which groups that we have names for, we have written documents for, and that in the 20th century was defined as a canon of ancient Near Eastern art that we can teach our students and our PhDs, who then go on to teach them to their students, et cetera, et cetera. So let's also recognize that groups have been interacting with archaeological sites for millennia and in ways that alter their preservation, the site's preservation. Groups dismantle ruins for the sake of repurposing abandoned materials for new settlements. In the rural communities where I work in Jordan, ruins are often defined as resources in the landscapes, much like water and soils and stone. And all these materials can be repurposed for immediate needs, say for agriculture. One can make a reasonable argument, I concede, that the destruction activities carried out by ISIS is motivated not by subsistence, but of course by ideologies seeking to promote their vision of political Islam. But even destruction in the name of ideology is not new in the Middle East. Those of us who study the region's history can point to several examples in which the armies of empires prioritize the destruction of enemy cities, their monuments, and their art for destruction. I think Patty showed this yesterday as her first slide, as she was showing how the Romans were carting away the war booty from the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. So what I believe is new, however, if there's something to be said that's new about what we're seeing today, it's that groups have the technologies, maybe it's dynamite, maybe it's a video camera, and therefore the capacity to destroy objects in dramatic and in effective ways that invite spectacle. Consider the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan in 2001. Before the Taliban arrived with their dynamite to destroy the figures in a few quick explosions, the most significant threats were wind and water that were eroding the figures at a pace immeasurable to the naked eye. Hence, it is 20th century technologies that provide the capacities for groups to carry out their ideological causes in theatrical displays of iconoclasm. So these questions and my musings on them are, of course, intellectual responses. I recognize what I'm saying here is rather heady. And they're designed to place the recent acts of destruction in a broader historical and cultural light. As many of you in the room know, that I know, I've long struggled with how to position my own disciplinary practices in light of Middle Eastern archaeology's challenging legacy on one hand, and the region's shifting political and cultural landscape on the other hand. For me, the road forward concerns the following question, that for me at least, I'm most concerned with. Can archaeologists contribute in tangible and thoughtful ways to sustainable economic development projects in the Middle East? Can we leverage our efforts and expertise as scientists and humanists to assist the communities in which we work to develop economic resources around archaeological and cultural tourism? If you want to answer these questions affirmatively, and I know these are rather laden claims, anytime you talk about the notion of development, you always have a tremendous amount of baggage flowing over you, I realize. If we want to answer these questions affirmatively, we need to identify the intersection of archaeology with development and tourism studies. Upon doing so, one discovers that although these three fields often overlap in practice, like we see the impact of tourism and development and archaeological research, they appear to have very limited awareness of each other. Without much planning, there's been a division of labor that has developed between the three worlds. Archaeologists, I contend, work on the supply side of the equation. They locate and they excavate antiquity sites for their own research purposes and are often excused from developing these sites for public presentation. Rather, it's state actors or international development agencies and nonprofit organizations that inherit the leftover materials of archaeological field research and attempt to transform them into viable destinations like Petra and Palmyra. But accompanying these development projects are local private industries. For example, small hotels, restaurants, kiosks, guiding services. These small-scale enterprises have the potential to be locally generative and sustainable, but they often remain at the mercy of external forces such as global shifts in tourism practices, like the rise and fall of tourism based on local events, as well as regional unrest. The results are often painful boom and bust economies that are motivated by the promise of long-term growth in capital. Archaeological tourism can unintentionally fuel wealth inequalities as a result. Now, I've been hypothesizing for some time now that many of the issues surrounding archaeological site development can be remedied if development is prioritized from the moment that research begins. Now, over the last, a little bit about what I've been working on over the last 10 years at rural sites in Jordan. I have been trying to, as I lead research projects there, at the same time, I've been trying to implement projects that would be by and for the community that would boost their economic livelihood. In the kind of, let's call it ethnographic research that I've done in the country of Jordan, I've discovered that the time periods that I'm most interested in as a scholar are not the time periods that local communities believe are part of their heritage, what they would call as turath, and part of their inheritance. Like for them, for many of the Jordanian communities in which I work, heritage is defined as something that happens after 1700, as something relatively recently that falls within the Ottoman period. And so their personal connection with the, say, Bronze and Iron Age societies in which I'm a specialist of, it really means only to them as an opportunity for a source of revenue, for economic revenue. So how then do I work with state actors, with local communities, as well as as an archaeologist? How do I leverage all of those things, bring them together to create very viable opportunities for young people in the community, for women, or for the disempowered groups? It's not easy. I could spend the next hour talking about all of the failures that I've had, and I could spend 5 minutes talking about the successes that I had. So the story is not over with yet, but it is an instance where, and I'll get to this in a moment, where archaeologists, I think, can start to engage in the modern world, in the modern Middle East, in ways that are much more thoughtful than this sort of simply excavating and then just leaving these materials in the ground and then letting other people do what they want with them. So I also want to comment on, and then I'll sort of move to my thoughts about today's remarks, just in brief. I want to comment on how we prepare the next generation of archaeologists to respond to the future crises that will no doubt arise in the Middle East and elsewhere. In the major training universities of North America and Europe, including here at Berkeley, we train students in archaeological field methods, in laboratory techniques, and ancient languages. This training usually takes 4 years of coursework, 4 years of your life, more for some, before our students embark on an independent dissertation project. Students are rarely encouraged to learn a modern Middle Eastern language. They're rarely encouraged to attend courses or internships in archaeological site management or architectural conservation. And they're rarely encouraged to, say, study microeconomic models that might help them develop sustainable economies in the Middle East. In other words, our current curriculum in Near Eastern archaeology, or perhaps archaeology across the campus, has not changed much since the 1960s. I keep waiting to hear which university is going to design that innovative curriculum that will train archaeologists who are prepared to conduct research in the 21st century Middle East, rather than this 19th century Victorian imaginary of the ancient Orient. That is, a curriculum that will prepare scholars to thoughtfully engage in the region as a trained professional. So now, to sum up, I'm not sure if Berkeley right now is training students to be this, engaged practitioners of archaeology of the Middle East for the next 20 years. And I certainly would like to see that change. I see I have about 10 minutes here, and I certainly would like to leave some time for people to ask questions, whether or not those questions are of me or of someone else. What strikes me about today's talks is how I think we're living in a period of the new normal, which I think is really exciting and fun. This is an exciting time to be working, studying, or at least paying attention to the Middle East. In my new project, I often think about how are future archaeologists going to be thinking about this period in the discipline. Like that person who writes the history of Near Eastern archaeology in the 21st century, what will they be saying about, say, the period from 2000 to 2020? And I think right now the tone of today's talks have been rather somber. we've seen a lot of evidence for destruction. And I hopefully have made that point that I believe that destruction, that level of destruction has been happening for several decades. But nevertheless, our awareness of it is what is new. And so we're living in a time period in which I'd call this the new normal. And I think what we've seen today are different ways that people from various communities are responding to that new normal. So if that's true, if we assume that's true just for the moment, I want to know if we're only going to be having these conversations when there is evidence for dramatic and televised conflict in the region. Like, can we have these conversations, and can we be doing this creative work and this engaged work? Can we do it in, do we really need to be doing it within the shadow of a conflict? Can we be talking about this, say, after the Syrian peace process, inshallah, is completed? Do we have to be skipping from conflict to conflict? And as a result of, nevertheless, what permanent infrastructure is coming out of this moment in time that will be able to perpetuate these conversations? I ask this question as I think about the great work that we see the American Schools of Oriental Research is sponsoring. And it's very much, finally, it's a 100-year institution. It's finally engaging and recognizing that they, as a professional society that's concerned with the archaeology of the Middle East, that they actually play a role in the production of knowledge about the Middle East, and they're actually taking some responsibility for it. And I think that's a really great thing that's coming out of the Cultural Heritage Initiative that we saw evidence for today in your talk. I want to know if ASOR would be as engaged in this type of work, however, if they had not received that grant. And hopefully, I want to know what they're doing to ensure that their work continues after the funding ends. I want to know how this money that's coming from the State Department is actually creating a sustainable infrastructure for their work. There's another question that came out of this morning's conversation that I didn't feel was answered, but I thought it had a lot of exciting possibilities, and that is, how will cultural heritage materials play a role in future peace and reconciliation activities in the Middle East, but in Syria in particular? I think that was raised toward the end of the morning session, but I would have really liked to have heard some tangible examples of what that's going to look like. Because in the end, that's why we're trying to, quote unquote, save the cultural heritage of Syria, is that so there'll be some raw materials available with which the different and diverse Syrian communities can co-imagine a cohesive collective identity. Now, for our latter panel today, where we're talking about practice, I've said many of the things I wanted to say, and that I think one of the coolest things is that we're learning how artists respond to cultural heritage issues. And I think this perspective is one that needs to be told. For me, what was very exciting was to see our academics who are doing public work, activist work, sitting alongside artists today, and just to see them side by side and speaking in a way that was very much a dialogue. I imagine in a different iteration, maybe at Stanford, I don't know, maybe at a different university, you would actually see those separate panels. There would have been panel 1 with all the sort of wonky intellectuals, and then panel 2, people doing the so-called creative work. So it was really, I think, a great move to entangle those two communities together today. That was fun. I wanted to hear more about digital colonialism. I do, because I saw, every time I see satellite imagery and people talking about we're monitoring this site, it sounds like digital imperialism to me. So is that what space archaeology is, Michael? We'll see. But I think the issue of who owns, as we were talking about authenticity and then the meta, if you will, who owns digital content? Because if we say who owns the past, then I think the question we're going to be needing to answer in the next 5 years is who owns the digital content that that is produced from that past. And it's something that Michael Ashley, you're working with Mokutu, which is a really cool platform. And this is something that at the Hearst Museum we're always thinking about too. But there's, of course, the object. and there may be copies of the object. But then there's all this really interesting information around the object, too, that we need to think about as, do we think about it as cultural property, or do we think about it as something that's open? So that, on one hand, a museum can own an object, but the information about that object could be publicly shared. We're going to have to wrestle with that in the next 5 to 6 years. I also, just want to return to how I see so many of the people up in the second panel today doing disruptive work, both in the academy. Let me talk about that for a moment. Like, they're doing disruptive work in the academy because they're doing the kinds of things. I just want to impress this upon people who don't have to spend every day, luckily, in the academy, is that they're doing things that are not easily rewarded in the academy. They're doing things that are really getting out into the field. They're interacting with people, real people, and they're really bringing information to them. They're creating opportunities for collaboration and new awareness. These are things that are not rewarded at the University of California, Berkeley. These are, they are when they make it onto the front page of the website, but in reality, when it comes to how do you get promoted around here, you write a book. Really, you write a book. And mine are for sale on Amazon if you're interested. But truly, the kinds of things we see up here are being done with like sweat equity and love. And they're not getting enough attention as they should be getting because the sort of old-fashioned world of academia is not rewarding them in the way that they should. So I would like to see in the next 10, 15 years ways for these types of groups to be, these types of projects and initiatives to be rewarded in a very authentic way rather than just like lip service in the media to show that you're doing, you're working with communities and community work. But in fact that you're really actually being able to sustain your own livelihood, with this important work. But I also think that these great scholars working up here this afternoon are doing things that are disruptive for our everyday folk understandings of the past. For example, they're creating knowledge and they're creating new ideas and models that are going to disrupt the narratives that you see on the History Channel or in the Discovery Channel or that are currently in, say, children's textbooks K through 12. They're making the past more accessible to people in their everyday lives so that they can interpret them and that they can question and push back against those narratives. And so those are the kinds of things I feel, again, should be rewarded. And they're going to be broadcast in such a way that it's going to be pushing against National Geographic. It's going to be pushing against the History Channel. It's going to be pushing against the Discovery Channel because those are the types of narratives that have been, produced in the 20th century and put out there for you to consume. They're safe. They're sanitized. There's usually winners and losers. But as students of history know, things get much more complicated. So I think that's what's really exciting and why these kinds of initiatives, as diverse as they are, certainly need our support. We need to talk about them with our friends. We need to do the research on them on the internet. We need to find creative ways to fund them. I think that's all. I'll say. Thanks again for a wonderful day of talks. I hope we can have more of these. The conversation will continue. A round of applause for our participants and our organizers.